Section 18 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 18. The Story of Ala ad-Din, or The Wonderful Lamp, Part 3. As it was now late, and the time for admission to the palace was past, it was put off till the next day. The mother and son talked of different matters the remaining part of the day, and Ala ad-Din strove to encourage her in the task she had undertaken, while she, notwithstanding all his arguments, could not persuade herself she should succeed, and it must be confessed she had reason enough to doubt. "Child," said she to Ala ad-Din, "if the Sultan should receive me as favourably as I wish for your sake, should even hear my proposal with calmness, and, after this scarcely to be expected reception, should think of asking me where lie your riches and your estate, for he will sooner inquire after these than your person. If I say he should ask me these questions, what answer would you have me return him?" "Let us not be uneasy, mother," replied Ala ad-Din, "about what may never happen. First, let us see how the Sultan receives and what answer he gives you. If it should so fall out that he desires to be informed of what you mention, I have thought of an answer, and am confident that the lamp which hath supported us so long will not fail me in time of need." The tailor's widow could not say anything against what her son then proposed, but reflected that the lamp might be capable of doing greater wonders than just providing victuals for them. This consideration satisfied her, and at the same time removed all the difficulties which might have prevented her from undertaking the service she had promised her son with the Sultan. Ala ad-Din, who penetrated into his mother's thoughts, said to her, "Above all things, mother, be sure to keep secret our possession of the lamp, for thereupon depends the success we have to expect." And after this caution, Ala ad-Din and his mother parted to go to rest. But violent love, and the great prospect of so immense a fortune, had so much possessed the son's thoughts, that he could not repose himself so well as he could have wished. He rose before daybreak, awakened his mother, pressing her to get herself dressed to go to the Sultan's palace, and to get admittance, if possible, before the Grand Vizier, the other viziers, and the great officers of state went in to take their seats in the divan, where the Sultan always assisted in person. Ala ad-Din's mother took the china dish in which they had put the jewels the day before, wrapped in 2 napkins, one finer than the other, which was tied at the 4 corners for more easy carriage, and set forward for the Sultan's palace. When she came to the gates, the Grand Vizier, the other viziers, and most distinguished lords of the court were just gone in. But notwithstanding the crowd of people who had business was great, she got into the divan, a spacious hall, the entrance into which was very magnificent. She placed herself just before the Sultan, Grand Vizier, and the great lords, who sat in council on his right and left hand. Several causes were called, according to their order, pleaded and adjudged, until the time the divan generally broke up, when the Sultan, rising, returned to his apartment, attended by the Grand Vizier. The other viziers and ministers of state then retired, as also did those whose business had called them thither, some pleased with gaining their causes, others dissatisfied at the sentences pronounced against them, and some in expectation of theirs being heard the next sitting. Ala ad-Din's mother, seeing the Sultan retire and all the people depart, judged rightly that he would not sit again that day, and resolved to go home. When Ala ad-Din saw her return with the present designed for the Sultan, he knew not what to think of her success, and in his fear lest she should bring him some ill news, had not courage to ask her any questions. But she, who had never set foot in the Sultan's palace before, and knew not what was every day practised there, freed him from his embarrassment, and said to him, with a great deal of simplicity, "Son, I have seen the Sultan, and am very well persuaded he has seen me too, for I placed myself just before him. But he was so much taken up with those who attended on all sides of him that I pitied him and wondered at his patience. At last I believe he was heartily tired, for he rose up suddenly and would not hear a great many who were ready prepared to speak to him, but went away, at which I was well pleased, for indeed I began to lose all patience, and was extremely fatigued with staying so long. But there is no harm done. I will go again tomorrow. Perhaps the Sultan may not be so busy." Though his passion was very violent, Ala ad-Din was forced to be satisfied with this delay, and to fortify himself with patience. He had at least the satisfaction to find that his mother had got over the greatest difficulty, which was to procure access to the Sultan, and hoped that the example of those she saw speak to him would embolden her to acquit herself better of her commission when a favourable opportunity might offer to speak to him. The next morning she repaired to the Sultan's palace with the present, as early as the day before. But when she came there, she found the gates of the divan shut, and understood that the council sat but every other day, therefore she must come again the next. This news she carried to her son, whose only relief was to guard himself with patience. She went 6 times afterwards on the days appointed, placed herself always directly before the Sultan, but with as little success as the first morning, and might have perhaps come 1,000 times to as little purpose, if luckily the Sultan himself had not taken particular notice of her, for only those who came with petitions approached the Sultan, when each pleaded their cause in its turn, and Ala ad-Din's mother was not one of them. On the 6th day, however, after the divan was broken up, when the Sultan returned to his own apartment, he said to his Grand Vizier, "I have for some time observed a certain woman, who attends constantly every day that I give audience, with something wrapped up in a napkin. She always stands up from the beginning to the breaking up of the audience, and affects to place herself just before me. Do you know what she wants?" "Sir," replied the Grand Vizier, who knew no more than the Sultan what she wanted, but did not wish to seem uninformed, "Your Majesty knows that women often make complaints on trifles. Perhaps she may come to complain to your Majesty that somebody has sold her some bad flour, or some such trifling matter." The Sultan was not satisfied with this answer, but replied, "If this woman comes to our next audience, do not fail to call her, that I may hear what she has to say." The Grand Vizier made answer by lowering his hand, and then lifting it up above his head, signifying his willingness to lose it if he failed. By this time the tailor's widow was so much used to go to audience and stand before the Sultan, that she did not think it any trouble, if she could but satisfy her son that she neglected nothing that lay in her power to please him. The next audience day she went to the divan, placed herself in front of the Sultan as usual, and before the Grand Vizier had made his report of business, the Sultan perceived her, and compassionating her for having waited so long, said to the Vizier, "Before you enter upon any business, remember the woman I spoke to you about. Bid her come near, and let us hear and dispatch her business first." The Grand Vizier immediately called the chief of the mace-bearers, who stood ready to obey his commands, and pointing to her, bade him go to that woman, and tell her to come before the Sultan. The chief of the officers went to Ala ad-Din's mother, and at a sign he gave her, she followed him to the foot of the Sultan's throne, where he left her and retired to his place by the Grand Vizier. The old woman, after the example of others whom she saw salute the Sultan, bowed her head down to the carpet, which covered the platform of the throne, and remained in that posture till the Sultan bade her rise, which she had no sooner done than he said to her, "Good woman, I have observed you to stand a long time, from the beginning to the rising of the divan. What business brings you here?" After these words, Alla ad Deen's mother prostrated herself a second time, and when she arose, said, "Monarch of monarchs, before I tell your majesty the extraordinary and almost incredible business which brings me before your high throne, I beg of you to pardon the boldness, or rather impudence, of the demand I am going to make, which is so uncommon that I tremble, and am ashamed to propose it to my sovereign." In order to give her the more freedom to explain herself, the sultan ordered all to quit the divan but the grand vizier, and then told her she might speak without restraint. Alla ad Deen's mother, not content with this favour of the sultan's to save her the trouble and confusion of speaking before so many people, was notwithstanding for securing herself against his anger, which, from the proposal she was going to make, she was not a little apprehensive of. Therefore, resuming her discourse, she said, "I beg of your majesty, if you should think my demand the least injurious or offensive, to assure me first of your pardon and forgiveness." "Well," replied the sultan, "I will forgive you, be it what it may, and no hurt shall come to you. Speak boldly." When Alla ad Deen's mother had taken all these precautions, for fear of the sultan's anger, she told him faithfully how Alla ad Deen had seen the princess Buddir al-Buddur, the violent love that fatal sight had inspired him with, the declaration he had made to her of it when he came home, and what representations she had made to dissuade him from a passion no less disrespectful, said she, to your majesty as sultan, than to the princess your daughter. But, continued she, my son, instead of taking my advice and reflecting on his presumption, was so obstinate as to persevere, and to threaten me with some desperate act if I refused to come and ask the princess in marriage of your majesty. And it was not without the greatest reluctance that I was led to accede to his request, for which I beg your majesty once more to pardon not only me, but also Alla ad Deen my son, for entertaining so rash a project as to aspire to so high an alliance." The sultan hearkened to this discourse with mildness, and without showing the least anger, but before he gave her any answer, asked her what she had brought tied up in the napkin. She took the china dish, which she had set down at the foot of the throne before she prostrated herself before him, untied it, and presented it to the sultan. The sultan's amazement and surprise were inexpressible when he saw so many large, beautiful, and valuable jewels collected in the dish. He remained for some time motionless with admiration. At last, when he had recovered himself, he received the present from Alla ad Deen's mother's hand, crying out in a transport of joy, "How rich! How beautiful!" After he had admired and handled all the jewels, one after another, he turned to his grand vizier, and showing him the dish, said, "Behold, admire, wonder, and confess that your eyes never beheld jewels so rich and beautiful before." The vizier was charmed. "Well," continued the sultan, "what sayest thou to such a present? Is it not worthy of the princess my daughter? And ought I not to bestow her on one who values her at so great price?" These words put the grand vizier into extreme agitation. The sultan had some time before signified to him his intention of bestowing the princess on a son of his. Therefore he was afraid, and not without grounds, that the sultan, dazzled by so rich and extraordinary a present, might change his mind. Therefore, going to him, and whispering him in the ear, he said, "I cannot but own that the present is worthy of the princess, but I beg of your majesty to grant me 3 months before you come to a final resolution. I hope before that time my son, on whom you have had the goodness to look with a favourable eye, will be able to make a nobler present than Alla ad Deen, who is an entire stranger to your Majesty." The Sultan, though he was fully persuaded that it was not possible for the vizier to provide so considerable a present for his son to make the princess, yet, as he had given him hopes, hearkened to him and granted his request. Turning therefore to the old widow, he said to her, "Good woman, go home and tell your son that I agree to the proposal you have made me, but I cannot marry the princess my daughter till the paraphernalia I design for her be got ready, which cannot be finished these 3 months, but at the expiration of that time come again." Ala ad-Din's mother returned home much more gratified than she had expected, since she had met with a favourable answer, instead of the refusal and confusion she had dreaded. For 2 circumstances, Ala ad-Din, when he saw his mother returning, judged that she brought him good news. The one was that she returned sooner than ordinary, and the other the gaiety of her countenance. "Well, mother," said he, "may I entertain any hopes, or must I die with despair?" When she had pulled off her veil and had seated herself on the sofa by him, she said to him, "Not to keep you long in suspense, son, I will begin by telling you that instead of thinking of dying, you have every reason to be well satisfied." Then, pursuing her discourse, she told him that she had an audience before everybody else, which made her come home so soon. The precautions she had taken lest she should have displeased the Sultan by making the proposal of marriage between him and the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor, and the condescending answer she had received from the Sultan's own mouth, and that as far as she could judge, the present had wrought a powerful effect. "But when I least expected it," said she, "and he was going to give me an answer, and I fancied a favourable one, the Grand Vizier whispered him in the ear, and I was afraid might be some obstacle to his good intentions towards us, and so it happened, for the Sultan desired me to come to audience again this day 3 months." Ala ad-Din thought himself the most happy of all men at hearing this news, and thanked his mother for the pains she had taken in the affair, the good success of which was of so great importance to his peace. Though from his impatience to obtain the object of his passion, 3 months seemed an age, yet he disposed himself to wait with patience, relying on the Sultan's word, which he looked upon to be irrevocable. But all that time he not only counted the hours, days, and weeks, but every moment. When 2 of the 3 months were past, his mother one evening going to light the lamp, and finding no oil in the house, went out to buy some, and when she came into the city, found a general rejoicing. The shops, instead of being shut up, were open, dressed with foliage, silks, and carpeting, every one striving to show their zeal in the most distinguished manner, according to his ability. The streets were crowded with officers in habits of ceremony, mounted on horses richly caparisoned, each attended by a great many footmen. Ala ad-Din's mother asked the oil merchant what was the meaning of all this preparation of public festivity. "Whence came you, good woman," said he, "that you don't know that the Grand Vizier's son is to marry the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor, the Sultan's daughter, tonight? She will presently return from the baths, and these officers whom you see are to assist at the cavalcade to the palace, where the ceremony is to be solemnized." This was news enough for Ala ad-Din's mother. She ran till she was quite out of breath home to her son, who little suspected any such event. "Child," cried she, "you are undone. You depend upon the Sultan's fine promises, but they will come to nothing." Ala ad-Din was alarmed at these words. "Mother," replied he, "how do you know the Sultan has been guilty of a breach of promise?" "This night," answered the mother, "the Grand Vizier's son is to marry the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor." She then related how she had heard it, so that from all circumstances he had no reason to doubt the truth of what she said. At this account Ala ad-Din was thunderstruck. Any other man would have sunk under the shock, but a sudden hope of disappointing his rival soon roused his spirits, and he bethought himself of the lamp, which had on every emergence been so useful to him, and without venting his rage in empty words against the sultan, the vizier, or his son, he only said, "Perhaps, mother, the vizier's son may not be so happy tonight as he promises himself. While I go into my chamber a moment, do you get supper ready." She accordingly went about it, but guessed that her son was going to make use of the lamp, to prevent, if possible, the consummation of the marriage. When Ala ad-Din had got into his chamber, he took the lamp, rubbed it in the same place as before, when immediately the genie appeared and said to him, "What wouldst thou have? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of all those who have that lamp in their possession, I and the other slaves of the lamp." "Hear me," said Ala ad-Din. "Thou hast hitherto brought me whatever I wanted as to provisions, but now I have business of the greatest importance for thee to execute. I have demanded the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor in marriage of the Sultan her father. He promised her to me, only requiring 3 months' delay, but instead of keeping that promise, has this night married her to the Grand Vizier's son. What I ask of you is, that as soon as the bride and bridegroom are retired, you bring them both hither in their bed." "Master," replied the genie, "I will obey you. Have you any other commands?" "None at present," answered Ala ad-Din. The genie then disappeared. Ala ad-Din, having left his chamber, supped with his mother, with the same tranquillity of mind as usual, and after supper talked of the princess's marriage as of an affair wherein he had not the least concern. He then retired to his own chamber again, and left his mother to go to bed, but sat up waiting the execution of his orders to the genie. In the meantime, everything was prepared with the greatest magnificence in the sultan's palace to celebrate the princess's nuptials, and the evening was spent with all the usual ceremonies and great rejoicings till midnight, when the Grand Vizier's son, on a signal given him by the chief of the princess's eunuchs, slipped away from the company, and was introduced by that officer into the princess's apartment, where the nuptial bed was prepared. He went to bed first, and in a little time after, the sultaness, accompanied by her own women and those of the princess, brought the bride, who, according to the custom of new married ladies, made great resistance. The sultaness herself helped to undress her, put her into bed by a kind of violence, and after having kissed her and wished her good night, retired with the women to her own apartments. No sooner was the door shut than the genie, as the faithful slave of the lamp, and punctual in executing the command of those who possessed it, without giving the bridegroom the least time to caress his bride, to the great amazement of them both, took up the bed and transported it in an instant into Ala ad-Din's chamber, where he set it down. Ala ad-Din, who had waited impatiently for this moment, did not suffer the vizier's son to remain long in bed with the princess. "Take this new married man," said he to the genie, "shut him up in the outhouse, and come again tomorrow morning before daybreak." The genie instantly forced the vizier's son out of bed, carried him whither Ala ad-Din had commanded him, and after he had breathed upon him, which prevented him stirring, left him there. Passionate as was Ala ad-Din's love for the princess, he did not talk much to her when they were alone, but only said with a respectful air, "Fear nothing, adorable princess, you are here in safety, for notwithstanding the violence of my passion, which your charms have kindled, it shall never exceed the bounds of the profound adoration I owe you. If I have been forced to come to this extremity, it is not with any intention of affronting you, but to prevent an unjust rival's possessing you, contrary to the sultan your father's promise in favour of myself." The princess, who knew nothing of these particulars, gave very little attention to what Ala ad-Din could say. The fright and amazement of so surprising and unexpected an adventure had alarmed her so much that he could not get one word from her. However, he undressed himself, took the bridegroom's place, but lay with his back to the princess, putting a sabre between himself and her, to show that he deserved to be put to death if he attempted anything against her honour. Ala ad-Din, satisfied with having thus deprived his rival of the happiness he had flattered himself with, slept very soundly, though the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor never passed a night so ill in her life. And if we consider the condition in which the genie left the Grand Vizier's son, we may imagine that the new bridegroom spent it much worse. Ala ad-Din had no occasion the next morning to rub the lamp to call the genie, who appeared at the hour appointed, just when he had done dressing himself, and said to him, "I am here, master. What are your commands?" "Go," said Ala ad-Din, "fetch the vizier's son out of the place where you left him, put him into his bed again, and carry it to the sultan's palace from whence you brought it." The genie presently returned with the vizier's son. Ala ad-Din took up his sabre, the bridegroom was laid by the princess, and in an instant the nuptial bed was transported into the same chamber of the palace from whence it had been brought. But we must observe that all this time the genie never was visible either to the princess or the Grand Vizier's son. His hideous form would have made them die with fear. Neither did they hear anything of the discourse between Ala ad-Din and him. They only perceived the motion of the bed and their transportation from one place to another, which we may well imagine was enough to alarm them. As soon as the genie had set down the nuptial bed in its proper place, the sultan tapped at the door to wish her good morning. The Grand Vizier's son, who was almost perished with cold by standing in his thin undergarment all night, and had not had time to warm himself in bed, no sooner heard the knocking at the door than he got out of bed and ran into the robing chamber, where he had undressed himself the night before. The sultan, having opened the door, went to the bedside, kissed the princess between the eyes, according to custom, wished her a good morrow, but was extremely surprised to see her so melancholy. She only cast at him a sorrowful look, expressive of great affliction or great dissatisfaction. He said a few words to her, but finding that he could not get a word from her, attributed it to her modesty, and retired. Nevertheless, he suspected that there was something extraordinary in this silence, and thereupon went immediately to the sultaness's apartment, told her in what a state he had found the princess, and how she had received him. "Sir," said the sultaness, "your majesty ought not to be surprised at this behaviour. New married people have naturally a reserve about them. 2 or 3 days hence she will receive the sultan her father as she ought. But I will go and see her," added she. "I am much deceived if she receives me in the same manner." As soon as the sultaness was dressed, she went to the princess's apartment, who was still in bed. She undrew the curtain, wished her good morrow, and kissed her. But how great was her surprise when she returned no answer, and looking more attentively at her, she perceived her to be much dejected, which made her judge that something had happened which she did not understand. "How comes it, child," said the sultaness, "that you do not return my caresses? Ought you to treat your mother after this manner? I am induced to believe something extraordinary has happened. Come, tell me freely, and leave me no longer in a painful suspense." At last the princess broke silence with a deep sigh, and said, "Alas, most honoured mother, forgive me if I have failed in the respect I owe you. My mind is so full of the extraordinary circumstances which have befallen me this night, that I have not yet recovered my amazement and alarm." She then told her how the instant after she and her husband were together, the bed was transported into a dark, dirty room, where he was taken from her and carried away, but where she knew not, and that she was left alone with a young man, who, after he had said something to her, which her fright did not suffer her to hear, laid himself in her husband's place, but first put his sabre between them, and in the morning her husband was brought to her again, when the bed was transported back to her own chamber in an instant. "All this," said she, "was but just done when the Sultan my father came into my chamber. I was so overwhelmed with grief that I had not power to speak, and am afraid that he is offended at the manner in which I received the honour he did me. But I hope he will forgive me when he knows my melancholy adventure and the miserable state I am in at present." The Sultaness heard all the Princess told her very patiently, but would not believe it. "You did well, child," said she, "not to speak of this to your father. Take care not to mention it to anybody, for you will certainly be thought mad if you talk in this manner." "Madam," replied the Princess, "I can assure you I am in my right senses. Ask my husband, and he will tell you the same circumstances." "I will," said the Sultaness, "but if he should talk in the same manner, I shall not be better persuaded of the truth. Come, rise, and throw off this idle fancy. It will be a strange event if all the feasts and rejoicings in the kingdom should be interrupted by such a vision. Do you not hear the trumpets of congratulation and concerts of the finest music? Cannot these inspire you with joy and pleasure, and make you forget the fancies of an imagination disturbed by what can have been only a dream?" At the same time the Sultaness called the Princess's women, and after she had seen her get up and begin dressing, went to the Sultan's apartment, told him that her daughter had got some odd notions in her head, but that there was nothing in them but idle fantasy. She then sent for the Vizier's son, to know of him something of what the Princess had told her, but he, thinking himself highly honoured to be allied to the Sultan, and not willing to lose the Princess, denied what had happened. "That is enough," answered the Sultaness. "I ask no more. I see you are wiser than my daughter." The rejoicings lasted all that day in the palace, and the Sultaness, who never left the Princess, forgot nothing to divert her and induce her to take part in the various diversions and shows. But she was so struck with the idea of what had happened to her in the night, that it was easy to see her thoughts were entirely taken up with it. Neither was the Grand Vizier's son in less tribulation, though his ambition made him disguise his feelings so well that nobody doubted of his being a happy bridegroom. Alla ad Deen, who was well acquainted with what passed in the palace, was sure the new married couple were to sleep together again, notwithstanding the troublesome adventure of the night before, and therefore, having as great an inclination to disturb them, had recourse to his lamp. And when the genie appeared and offered his service, he said to him, "The Grand Vizier's son and the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor are to sleep together again tonight. Go, and as soon as they are in bed, bring the bed hither, as thou didst yesterday." The genie obeyed as faithfully and exactly as the day before. The Grand Vizier's son passed the night as coldly and disagreeably, and the Princess had the mortification again to have Alla ad Deen for her bedfellow, with the sabre between them. The genie, according to orders, came the next morning, brought the bridegroom, laid him by his bride, and then carried the bed and new married couple back again to the palace. The Sultan, after the reception the Princess had given him, was very anxious to know how she had passed the second night, and therefore went into her chamber as early as the morning before. The Grand Vizier's son, more ashamed and mortified with the ill success of this last night, no sooner heard him coming than he jumped out of bed and ran hastily into the robing chamber. The Sultan went to the Princess's bedside, and after the same caresses he had given her the former morning, bade her good morrow. "Well, daughter," said he, "are you in a better humour than yesterday?" Still the Princess was silent, and the Sultan, perceiving her to be more troubled and in greater confusion than before, doubted not that something very extraordinary was the cause, but provoked that his daughter should conceal it, he said to her in a rage, with his sabre in his hand, "Daughter, tell me what is the matter, or I will cut off your head immediately." The princess, more frightened at the menaces and tone of the enraged sultan than at the sight of the drawn sabre, at last broke silence, and said with tears in her eyes, "My dear father and sultan, I ask your majesty's pardon if I have offended you, and hope that out of your goodness and clemency you will have compassion on me, when I shall have told you in what a miserable condition I have spent this last night as well as the preceding." After this preamble, which appeased and affected the sultan, she told him what had happened to her in so moving a manner that he, who loved her tenderly, was most sensibly grieved. She added, "If your majesty doubts the truth of this account, you may inform yourself from my husband, who, I am persuaded, will tell you the same thing." The sultan immediately felt all the extreme uneasiness so surprising an adventure must have given the princess. "Daughter," said he, "you are much to blame for not telling me this yesterday, since it concerns me as much as yourself. I did not marry you with an intention to make you miserable, but that you might enjoy all the happiness you deserve, and might hope for from a husband who to me seemed agreeable to you. Efface all these troublesome ideas from your memory. I will take care that you shall have no more disagreeable and insupportable nights." As soon as the sultan had returned to his own apartment, he sent for the Grand Vizier. "Vizier," said he, "have you seen your son, and has he told you anything?" The Vizier replied, "No." The sultan related all the circumstances of which the princess had informed him, and afterwards said, "I do not doubt but that my daughter has told me the truth, but nevertheless I should be glad to have it confirmed by your son. Therefore, go and ask him how it was." End of Section 18. Section 19 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 19. The Story of Ala ad-Din, or the Wonderful Lamp. Part 4. The Grand Vizier went immediately to his son, communicated what the Sultan had told him, and enjoined him to conceal nothing, but to relate the whole truth. "I will disguise nothing from you, father," replied the son, "for indeed all that the princess has stated is true. But what relates particularly to myself she knows nothing of. Since my marriage I have passed 2 nights beyond imagination or expression disagreeable, not to mention the fright I was in at finding my bed lifted 4 times, transported from one place to another, without being able to guess how it was done. You may judge of the miserable condition I was in, passing 2 whole nights in nothing but my undervestments, standing in a kind of closet, unable to stir out of the place, or to make the least movement, though I could not perceive any obstacle to prevent me. Yet I must tell you that all this ill usage does not in the least lessen those sentiments of love, respect, and gratitude I entertain for the princess, and of which she is so deserving. But I must confess that notwithstanding all the honour and splendour that attends marrying my sovereign's daughter, I would much rather die than continue in so exalted an alliance, if I must undergo nightly much longer what I have already endured. I do not doubt but that the princess entertains the same sentiments, and that she will readily agree to a separation, which is so necessary both for her repose and mine. Therefore, father, I beg, by the same tenderness which led you to procure me so great an honour, to obtain the sultan's consent that our marriage may be declared null and void." Notwithstanding the Grand Vizier's ambition to have his son allied to the sultan, the firm resolution he saw he had formed to be separated from the princess made him not think it proper to propose to him to have patience for a few days, to see if this disappointment would not have an end. But he left him to give an account of what he had related to him, and without waiting till the sultan himself, whom he found disposed to it, spoke of setting aside the marriage, he begged of him to give his son leave to retire from the palace, alleging it was not just that the princess should be a moment longer exposed to so terrible a persecution upon his son's account. The Grand Vizier found no difficulty to obtain what he asked, as the Sultan had determined already. Orders were given to put a stop to all rejoicings in the palace and town, and expresses dispatched to all parts of his dominions to countermand them, and in a short time all rejoicings ceased. This sudden and unexpected change gave rise both in the city and kingdom to various speculations and inquiries, but no other account could be given of it, except that both the vizier and his son went out of the palace very much dejected. Nobody but Alla ad Deen knew the secret. He rejoiced within himself at the happy success procured by his lamp, which now he had no more occasion to rub, to produce the genie to prevent the consummation of the marriage, as he had certain information it was broken off, and that his rival had left the palace. Neither the Sultan nor the Grand Vizier, who had forgotten Alla ad Deen and his request, had the least thought that he had any concern in the enchantment which caused the dissolution of the marriage. Alla ad Deen waited till the 3 months were completed, which the Sultan had appointed for the consummation of the marriage between the Princess Buddir al Buddoor and himself, and the next day sent his mother to the palace to remind the Sultan of his promise. Alla ad Deen's mother went to the palace and stood in the same place as before in the hall of audience. The Sultan no sooner cast his eyes upon her than he knew her again, remembered her business, and how long he had put her off. Therefore, when the Grand Vizier was beginning to make his report, the Sultan interrupted him, and said, "Vizier, I see the good woman who made me the present of jewels some months ago. Forbear your report till I have heard what she has to say." The Vizier, looking about the divan, perceived the tailor's widow, and sent the chief of the mace-bearers to conduct her to the Sultan. Alla ad Deen's mother came to the foot of the throne, prostrated herself as usual, and when she arose, the Sultan asked her what she would have. "Sir," said she, "I come to represent to your majesty, in the name of my son Alla ad Deen, that the 3 months, at the end of which you ordered me to come again, are expired, and to beg you to remember your promise." The Sultan, when he had fixed a time to answer the request of this good woman, little thought of hearing any more of a marriage, which he imagined must be very disagreeable to the princess, when he considered the meanness and poverty of her dress and appearance. But this summons for him to fulfil his promise was somewhat embarrassing. He declined giving an answer till he had consulted his vizier, and signified to trim the little inclination he had to conclude a match for his daughter with a stranger, whose rank he supposed to be very mean. The Grand Vizier freely told the Sultan his thoughts, and said to him, "In my opinion, sir, there is an infallible way for your majesty to avoid a match so disproportionable, without giving Alla ad Deen, were he known to your majesty, any cause of complaint, which is to set so high a price upon the princess, that, however rich he may be, he cannot comply with. This is the only evasion to make him desist from so bold, not to say rash, an undertaking, which he never weighed before he engaged in it." The Sultan, approving of the Grand Vizier's advice, turned to the tailor's widow, and said to her, "Good woman, it is true sultans ought to abide by their word, and I am ready to keep mine, by making your son happy in marriage with the princess my daughter. But as I cannot marry her without some further valuable consideration from your son, you may tell him I will fulfil my promise as soon as he shall send me 40 trays of massive gold, full of the same sort of jewels you have already made me a present of, and carried by the like number of black slaves, who shall be led by as many young and handsome white slaves, all dressed magnificently. On these conditions I am ready to bestow the princess my daughter upon him. Therefore, good woman, go and tell him so, and I will wait till you bring me his answer." Alla ad Deen's mother prostrated herself a second time before the sultan's throne, and retired. In her way home she laughed within herself at her son's foolish imagination. "Where," said she, "can he get so many large gold trays, and such precious stones to fill them? Must he go again to that subterraneous abode, the entrance into which is stopped up, and gather them off the trees? But where will he get so many such slaves as the sultan requires? It is altogether out of his power, and I believe he will not be much pleased with my embassy this time." When she came home, full of these thoughts, she said to her son, "Indeed, child, I would not have you think any farther of your marriage with the princess. The sultan received me very kindly, and I believe he was well inclined to you. But if I am not much deceived, the grand vizier has made him change his mind, as you will guess from what I have to tell you. After I had represented to his majesty that the 3 months were expired, and begged of him to remember his promise, I observed that he whispered with his grand vizier before he gave me his answer." She then gave her son an exact account of what the sultan had said to her, and the conditions on which he consented to the match. Afterwards she said to him, "The sultan expects your answer immediately. But," continued she, laughing, "I believe he may wait long enough." "Not so long, mother, as you imagine," replied Alla ad Deen. "The sultan is mistaken if he thinks by this exorbitant demand to prevent my entertaining thoughts of the princess. I expected greater difficulties, and that he would have set a higher price upon her incomparable charms. I am very well pleased. His demand is but a trifle to what I could have done for her. But while I think of satisfying his request, go and get something for our dinner, and leave the rest to me." As soon as his mother was gone out to market, Alla ad Deen took the lamp, and rubbing it, the genie appeared, and offered his service as usual. "The sultan," said Alla ad Deen to him, "gives me the princess his daughter in marriage, but demands first 40 large trays of massive gold, full of the fruits of the garden from whence I took this lamp, and these he expects to have carried by as many black slaves, each preceded by a young handsome white slave, richly clothed. Go and fetch me this present as soon as possible, that I may send it to him before the divan breaks up." The genie told him his command should be immediately obeyed, and disappeared. In a little time afterwards the genie returned with 40 black slaves, each bearing on his head a heavy tray of pure gold, full of pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and every sort of precious stones, all larger and more beautiful than those presented to the sultan. Each tray was covered with silver tissue, embroidered with flowers of gold. These, together with the white slaves, quite filled the house, which was but a small one, the little court before it, and a small garden behind. The genie asked if he had any other commands, and Alla ad Deen telling him that he wanted nothing farther, he disappeared. When Alla ad Deen's mother came from market, she was much surprised to see so many people and such vast riches. As soon as she had laid down her provisions, she was going to pull off her veil, but he prevented her, and said, "Mother, let us lose no time. Before the sultan and the divan rise, I would have you return to the palace with this present as the dowry demanded for the princess, that he may judge by my diligence and exactness of the ardent and sincere desire I have to procure myself the honour of this alliance." Without waiting for his mother's reply, Alla ad Deen opened the street door, and made the slaves walk out, each white slave followed by a black with a tray upon his head. When they were all out, the mother followed the last black slave. He shut the door, and then retired to his chamber, full of hopes that the sultan, after this present, which was such as he required, would receive him as his son-in-law. The first white slave who went out bade all the people who were going by stop, and before they were all clear of the house, the streets were crowded with spectators, who ran to see so extraordinary and magnificent a procession. The dress of each slave was so rich, both for the stuff and the jewels, that those who were dealers in them valued each at no less than 1,000,000 of money. Besides the neatness and propriety of the dress, the noble air, fine shape, and proportion of each slave were unparalleled. Their grave walk at an equal distance from each other, the lustre of the jewels curiously set in their girdles of gold, in beautiful symmetry, and the egrets of precious stones in their turbans, which were of an unusual but elegant taste, put the spectators into such great admiration that they could not avoid gazing at them and following them with their eyes as far as possible. But the streets were so crowded with people that none could move out of the spot they stood on. As they had to pass through several streets to the palace, a great part of the city had an opportunity of seeing them. As soon as the first of these slaves arrived at the palace gate, the porters formed themselves into order, taking him for a prince from the richness and magnificence of his habit, and were going to kiss the hem of his garment. But the slave, who was instructed by the genie, prevented them, and said, "We are only slaves. Our master will appear at the proper time." The first slave, followed by the rest, advanced into the second court, which was very spacious, and in which the sultan's household was ranged during the sitting of the divan. The magnificence of the officers who stood at the head of their troops was considerably eclipsed by the slaves who bore Alla ad Deen's present, of which they themselves made a part. Nothing was ever seen so beautiful and brilliant in the sultan's palace, and all the lustre of the lords of his court was not to be compared to them. As the sultan, who had been informed of their march and approach to the palace, had given orders for them to be admitted, they met with no obstacle, but went into the divan in regular order, one part filing to the right and the other to the left. After they were all entered and had formed a semicircle before the sultan's throne, the black slaves laid the golden trays on the carpet, prostrated themselves, touching the carpet with their foreheads, and at the same time the white slaves did the same. When they rose, the black slaves uncovered the trays, and then all stood with their arms crossed over their breasts. In the meantime, Alla ad Deen's mother advanced to the foot of the throne, and having paid her respects, said to the sultan, "Sir, my son is sensible this present which he has sent your majesty is much below the Princess Buddir al Buddoor's worth, but hopes nevertheless that your majesty will accept of it, and make it agreeable to the princess, and with the greater confidence since he has endeavoured to conform to the conditions you were pleased to impose." The sultan was not able to give the least attention to this compliment. The moment he cast his eyes on the 40 trays, full of the most precious, brilliant, and beautiful jewels he had ever seen, and the 80 slaves, who appeared by the elegance of their persons and the richness and magnificence of their dress like so many princes, he was so struck that he could not recover from his admiration. Instead of answering the compliment of Alla ad Deen's mother, he addressed himself to the Grand Vizier, who could not any more than the sultan comprehend from whence such a profusion of richness could come. "Well, Vizier," said he aloud, "who do you think it can be that has sent me so extraordinary a present, and neither of us know? Do you think him worthy of the Princess Buddir al Buddoor, my daughter?" The vizier, notwithstanding his envy and grief to see a stranger preferred to be the sultan's son-in-law before his son, durst not disguise his sentiments. It was too visible that Alla ad Deen's present was more than sufficient to merit his being received into royal alliance. Therefore, consulting his master's feelings, he returned this answer: "I am so far from having any thoughts that the person who has made your majesty so noble a present is unworthy of the honour you would do him, that I should say he deserved much more, if I was not persuaded that the greatest treasure in the world ought not to be put in competition with the princess your majesty's daughter." This speech was applauded by all the lords who were then in council. The Sultan made no longer hesitation, nor thought of informing himself whether Alla ad Deen was endowed with all the qualifications requisite in one who aspired to be his son-in-law. The sight alone of such immense riches, and Alla ad Deen's quickness in satisfying his demand, without starting the least difficulty at the exorbitant conditions he had imposed, easily persuaded him that he could want nothing to render him accomplished, and such as he desired. Therefore, to send Alla ad Deen's mother back with all the satisfaction she could desire, he said to her, "My good lady, go and tell your son that I wait with open arms to embrace him, and the more haste he makes to come and receive the princess my daughter from my hands, the greater pleasure he will do me." As soon as the tailor's widow had retired, overjoyed, as a woman in her condition must have been, to see her son raised beyond all expectations to such exalted fortune, the sultan put an end to the audience, and rising from his throne, ordered that the princess's eunuchs should come and carry the trays into their mistress's apartment, whither he went himself, to examine them with her at his leisure. The 80 slaves were conducted into the palace, and the sultan, telling the princess of their magnificent appearance, ordered them to be brought before her apartment, that she might see through the lattices he had not exaggerated in his account of them. In the meantime, Alla ad Deen's mother got home, and showed in her air and countenance the good news she brought her son. "My son," said she to him, "you have now all the reason in the world to be pleased. You are, contrary to my expectations, arrived at the height of your desires. Not to keep you too long in suspense, the sultan, with the approbation of the whole court, has declared that you are worthy to possess the Princess Buddir al Buddoor, waits to embrace you and conclude your marriage. Therefore you must think of making some preparations for your interview, which may answer the high opinion he has formed of your person, and after the wonders I have seen you do, I am persuaded nothing can be wanting. But I must not forget to tell you the sultan waits for you with great impatience, therefore lose no time in paying your respects." Alla ad Deen, enraptured with this news, and full of the object which possessed his soul, made his mother very little reply, but retired to his chamber. There, after he had rubbed his lamp, which had never failed him in whatever he wished for, the obedient genie appeared. "Genie," said Alla ad Deen, "I want to bathe immediately, and you must afterwards provide me the richest and most magnificent habit ever worn by a monarch." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than the genie rendered him as well as himself invisible, and transported him into a hammam of the finest marble of all sorts of colours, where he was undressed, without seeing by whom, in a magnificent and spacious hall. From the hall he was led to the bath, which was of a moderate heat, and he was there rubbed and washed with various scented waters. After he had passed through several degrees of heat, he came out quite a different man from what he was before. His skin was clear white and red, his body lightsome and free, and when he returned into the hall, he found, instead of his own, a suit, the magnificence of which astonished him. The genie helped him to dress, and when he had done, transported him back to his own chamber, where he asked him if he had any other commands. "Yes," answered Alla ad Deen, "I expect you to bring me as soon as possible a charger that surpasses in beauty and goodness the best in the sultan's stables, with a saddle, bridle, and other caparisons worth 1,000,000 of money. I want also 20 slaves, as richly clothed as those who carried the present to the sultan, to walk by my side and follow me, and 20 more to go before me in 2 ranks. Besides these, bring my mother 6 women slaves to attend her, as richly dressed at least as any of the Princess Buddir al Buddoor's, each carrying a complete dress fit for any sultaness.
I want also 10,000 pieces of gold in 10 purses. Go, and make haste." As soon as Alla ad Deen had given these orders, the genie disappeared, but presently returned with the horse, the 40 slaves, 10 of whom carried each a purse containing 10,000 pieces of gold, and 6 women slaves, each carrying on her head a different dress for Alla ad Deen's mother, wrapped up in a piece of silver tissue, and presented them all to Alla ad Deen. Of the 10 purses, Alla ad Deen took 4, which he gave to his mother, telling her those were to supply her with necessaries. The other 6 he left in the hands of the slaves who brought them, with an order to throw them by handfuls among the people as they went to the sultan's palace. The 6 slaves who carried the purses he ordered likewise to march before him, 3 on the right hand and 3 on the left. Afterwards he presented the 6 women slaves to his mother, telling her they were her slaves, and that the dresses they had brought were for her use. When Alla ad Deen had thus settled matters, he told the genie he would call for him when he wanted him, and thereupon the genie disappeared. Alla ad Deen's thoughts now were only upon answering as soon as possible the desire the sultan had shown to see him. He dispatched one of the 40 slaves to the palace, with an order to address himself to the chief of the porters, to know when he might have the honour to come and throw himself at the sultan's feet. The slave soon acquitted himself of his commission, and brought for answer that the sultan waited for him with impatience. Alla ad Deen immediately mounted his charger and began his march, in the order we have already described, and though he never was on horseback before, appeared with such extraordinary grace that the most experienced horseman would not have taken him for a novice. The streets through which he was to pass were almost instantly filled with an innumerable concourse of people, who made the air echo with acclamations, especially every time the 6 slaves who carried the purses threw handfuls of gold among the populace. Neither did these acclamations and shouts of joy come from those alone who scrambled for the money, but from a superior rank of people, who could not forbear applauding Alla ad Deen's generosity. Not only those who knew him when he played in the streets like a vagabond did not recollect him, but those who saw him but a little while before hardly recognized him, so much were his features altered. Such were the effects of the lamp, as to procure by degrees, to those who possessed it, perfections suitable to the rank to which the right use of it advanced them. Much more attention was paid to Alla ad Deen's person than to the pomp and magnificence of his attendants, as a similar show had been seen the day before, when the slaves walked in procession with the present to the sultan. Nevertheless, the horse was much admired by good judges, who knew how to discern his beauties, without being dazzled by the jewels and richness of the furniture. When the report was everywhere spread that the sultan was going to have the princess in marriage to Alla ad Deen, nobody regarded his birth, nor envied his good fortune, so worthy he seemed of it in the public opinion. End of Section 19. Section 20 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 20. The Story of Alla ad Deen, or the Wonderful Lamp, Part 5. When he arrived at the palace, everything was prepared for his reception, and when he came to the gate of the second court, he would have alighted from his horse, agreeably to the custom observed by the Grand Vizier, the commander-in-chief of the empire, and governors of provinces of the first rank. But the chief of the mace-bearers, who waited on him by the sultan's order, prevented him, and attended him to the grand hall of audience, where he helped him to dismount, though Alla ad Deen endeavoured to prevent him, but could not prevail. The officers formed themselves into 2 ranks at the entrance of the hall. The chief put Alla ad Deen on his right hand, and through the midst of them led him to the sultan's throne. As soon as the sultan perceived Alla ad Deen, he was no less surprised to see him more richly and magnificently habited than ever he had been himself, than struck at his good mien,
fine shape, and a certain air of unexpected dignity, very different from the meanness of his mother's late appearance. But notwithstanding, his amazement and surprise did not hinder him from rising off his throne and descending 2 or 3 steps, quick enough to prevent Alla ad Deen's throwing himself at his feet. He embraced him with all the demonstrations of joy at his arrival. After this civility, Alla ad Deen would have thrown himself at his feet again, but he held him fast by the hand and obliged him to sit close to the throne. Alla ad Deen then addressed the sultan, saying, "I receive the honour which your majesty, out of your great condescension, is pleased to confer, but permit me to assure you that I have not forgotten that I am your slave, that I know the greatness of your power, and that I am not insensible how much my birth is below the splendour and lustre of the high rank to which I am raised. If any way," continued he, "I could have merited so favourable a reception, I confess I owe it merely to the boldness which chance inspired in me to raise my eyes, thoughts, and desires to the divine princess, who is the object of my wishes. I ask your majesty's pardon for my rashness, but I cannot dissemble that I should die with grief were I to lose my hopes of seeing them accomplished." "My son," answered the sultan, embracing him a second time, "you would wrong me to doubt for a moment of my sincerity. Your life from this moment is too dear to me not to preserve it, by presenting you with the remedy which is at my disposal. I prefer the pleasure of seeing and hearing you before all your treasure added to my own." After these words, the sultan gave a signal, and immediately the air echoed with the sound of trumpets, hautboys, and other musical instruments, and at the same time the sultan led Alla ad Deen into a magnificent hall, where was laid out a most splendid collation. The sultan and Alla ad Deen ate by themselves, while the grand vizier and the great lords of the court, according to their dignity and rank, sat at different tables. The conversation turned on different subjects, but all the while the sultan took so much pleasure in looking at his intended son-in-law that he hardly ever took his eyes off him, and throughout the whole of their conversation Alla ad Deen showed so much good sense as confirmed the sultan in the high opinion he had formed of him. After the feast, the sultan sent for the chief judge of his capital, and ordered him to draw up immediately a contract of marriage between the Princess Buddir al Buddoor, his daughter, and Alla ad Deen. In the meantime, the sultan and he entered into another conversation on various subjects, in the presence of the grand vizier and the lords of the court, who all admired the solidity of his wit, the great ease and freedom wherewith he delivered himself, the justness of his remarks, and his energy in expressing them. When the judge had drawn up the contract in all the requisite forms, the sultan asked Alla ad Deen if he would stay in the palace and solemnize the ceremonies of marriage that day, to which he answered, "Sir, though great is my impatience to enjoy your majesty's goodness, yet I beg of you to give me leave to defer it till I have built a palace fit to receive the princess. Therefore I petition you to grant me a convenient spot of ground near your palace, that I may the more frequently pay my respects, and I will take care to have it finished with all diligence." "Son," said the sultan, "take what ground you think proper. There is space enough on every quarter round my palace. But consider, I cannot see you too soon united with my daughter, which alone is wanting to complete my happiness." After these words he embraced Alla ad Deen again, who took his leave with as much politeness as if he had been bred up and had always lived at court. Alla ad Deen returned home in the order he had come, amidst the acclamations of the people, who wished him all happiness and prosperity. As soon as he dismounted, he retired to his own chamber, took the lamp, and called the genie as before, who in the usual manner made him a tender of his service. "Genie," said Alla ad Deen, "I have every reason to commend your exactness in executing hitherto punctually whatever I have demanded.
But now, if you have any regard for the lamp your protector, you must show, if possible, more zeal and diligence than ever. I would have you build me, as soon as you can, a palace opposite, but at a proper distance from, the sultans, fit to receive my spouse, the Princess Buddir al Buddoor. I leave the choice of the materials to you, that is to say, porphyry, jasper, agate, lapis lazuli, or the finest marble of various colours, and also the architecture of the building. But I expect that on the terraced roof of this palace you will build me a large hall, crowned with a dome, and having 4 equal fronts, and that instead of layers of bricks, the walls be formed of massive gold and silver, laid alternately, that each front shall contain 6 windows, the lattices of all which, except one, which must be left unfinished, shall be so enriched in the most tasteful workmanship, with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, that they shall exceed everything of the kind ever seen in the world. I would have an inner and outer court in front of the palace, and a spacious garden. But above all things, take care that there be laid in a place which you shall point out to me, a treasure of gold and silver coin. Besides, the edifice must be well provided with kitchens and offices, storehouses, and rooms to keep choice furniture in, for every season of the year. I must have stables full of the finest horses, with their equerries and grooms, and hunting equipage. There must be officers to attend the kitchens and offices, and women slaves to wait on the princess. You understand what I mean. Therefore, go about it, and come and tell me when all is finished." By the time Alla ad Deen had instructed the genie resetting the building of his palace, the sun was set. The next morning, before break of day, our bridegroom, whose love for the princess would not let him sleep, was up, when the genie presented himself and said, "Sir, your palace is finished. Come and see how you like it." Alla ad Deen had no sooner signified his consent than the genie transported him thither in an instant, and he found it so much beyond his expectation that he could not enough admire it. The genie led him through all the apartments, where he met with nothing but what was rich and magnificent, with officers and slaves, all habited according to their rank and the services to which they were appointed. The genie then showed him the treasury, which was opened by a treasurer, where Alla ad Deen saw heaps of purses of different sizes, piled up to the top of the ceiling, and disposed in most excellent order. The genie assured him of the treasurer's fidelity, and thence led him to the stables, where he showed him some of the finest horses in the world, and the grooms busy in dressing them. From thence they went to the storehouses, which were filled with all things necessary, both for food and ornament. When Alla ad Deen had examined the palace from top to bottom, and particularly the hall with the 24 windows, and found it much beyond whatever he could have imagined, he said, "Genie, no one can be better satisfied than I am, and indeed I should be much to blame if I found any fault. There is only one thing wanting, which I forgot to mention, that is, to lay from the sultan's palace to the door of the apartment designed for the princess, a carpet of fine velvet for her to walk upon." The genie immediately disappeared, and Alla ad Deen saw what he desired executed in an instant. The genie then returned, and carried him home before the gates of the sultan's palace were opened. When the porters, who had always been used to an open prospect, came to open the gates, they were amazed to find it obstructed, and to see a carpet of velvet spread from the grand entrance. They did not immediately look how far it extended, but when they could discern Alla ad Deen's palace distinctly, their surprise was increased. The news of so extraordinary a wonder was presently spread through the palace. The grand vizier, who arrived soon after the gates were open, being no less amazed than others at this novelty, ran and acquainted the sultan, but endeavoured to make him believe it to be all enchantment. "Vizier," replied the sultan, "why will you have it to be enchantment? You know as well as I that it must be Alla ad Deen's palace, which I gave him leave to build, for the reception of my daughter." After the proof we have had of his riches, can we think it strange that he should raise a palace in so short a time? He wished to surprise us, and let us see what wonders are to be done with money in only one night. Confess sincerely that the enchantment you talk of proceeds from a little envy, on account of your son's disappointment." The hour of going to council put an end to the conversation. When Alla ad Deen had been conveyed home, and had dismissed the genie, he found his mother up and dressing herself in one of those suits which had been brought her. By the time the sultan rose from the council, Alla ad Deen had prepared his mother to go to the palace with her slaves, and desired her, if she saw the sultan, to tell him she should do herself the honour to attend the princess towards evening to her palace. Accordingly she went, but though she and the women slaves who followed her were all dressed like sultanesses, yet the crowd was not near so great as the preceding day, because they were all veiled, and had each an upper garment on, agreeable to the richness and magnificence of their habits. Alla ad Deen mounted his horse and took leave of his paternal house for ever, taking care not to forget his wonderful lamp, by the assistance of which he had reaped such advantages, and arrived at the utmost height of his wishes, and went to the palace in the same pomp as the day before. As soon as the porters of the sultan's palace saw Alla ad Deen's mother, they went and informed the sultan, who immediately ordered the bands of trumpets, cymbals, drums, fifes, and hautboys, placed in different parts of the palace, to play, so that the air resounded with concerts which inspired the whole city with joy. The merchants began to adorn their shops and houses with fine carpets and silks, and to prepare illuminations against night. The artisans of every description left their work, and the populace repaired to the great space between the royal palace and that of Alla ad Deen, which last drew all their attention, not only because it was new to them, but because there was no comparison between the two buildings. But their amazement was to comprehend by what unheard of miracle so magnificent a palace could have been so soon erected, it being apparent to all that there were no prepared materials or any foundations laid the day before. Alla ad Deen's mother was received in the palace with honour, and introduced into the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor's apartment by the chief of the eunuchs. As soon as the princess saw her, she rose, saluted, and desired her to sit down on a sofa, and while her women finished dressing and adorning her with the jewels which Alla ad Deen had presented to her, a collation was served up. At the same time the sultan, who wished to be as much with his daughter as possible before he parted with her, came in and paid the old lady great respect. Alla ad Deen's mother had talked to the sultan in public, but he had never seen her with her veil off, as she was then, and though she was somewhat advanced in years, she had the remains of a good face, which showed what she had been in her youth. The sultan, who had always seen her dressed very meanly, not to say poorly, was surprised to find her as richly and magnificently attired as the princess his daughter. This made him think Alla ad Deen equally prudent and wise in whatever he undertook. When it was night, the princess took her leave of the sultan her father. Their adieus were tender and accompanied with tears. They embraced each other several times, and at last the princess left her apartment for Alla ad Deen's palace, with his mother on her left hand, carried in a superb litter, followed by 100 women slaves, dressed with surprising magnificence. All the bands of music, which had played from the time Alla ad Deen's mother arrived, being joined together, led the procession, followed by 100 state ushers, and the like number of black eunuchs in 2 files, with their officers at their head. 400 of the sultan's young pages carried flambeaux on each side, which, together with the illuminations of the sultan's and Alla ad Deen's palaces, made it as light as day. In this order the princess proceeded in her litter on the carpet, which was spread from the sultan's palace, preceded by bands of musicians, who, as they advanced, joining with those on the terraces of Alla ad Deen's palace, formed a concert, which increased the joyful sensations not only of the crowd assembled in the great square, but of the metropolis and its environs. At length the princess arrived at the new palace. Alla ad Deen ran with all imaginable joy to receive her at the grand entrance. His mother had taken care to point him out to the princess in the midst of the officers who surrounded him, and she was charmed with his person. "Adorable princess," said Alla ad Deen, accosting her and saluting her respectfully as soon as she had entered her apartment, "if I have the misfortune to have displeased you by my boldness in aspiring to the possession of so lovely a princess and my sultan's daughter, I must tell you that you ought to blame your bright eyes and charms, not me." "Prince, as I may now call you," answered the princess, "I am obedient to the will of my father, and it is enough for me to have seen you to tell you that I obey without reluctance." Alla ad Deen, charmed with so agreeable and satisfactory an answer, would not keep the princess standing, but took her by the hand, which he kissed with the greatest demonstration of joy, and led her into a large hall, illuminated with an infinite number of wax candles, where, by the care of the genie, a noble feast was served up. The dishes were of massive gold, and contained the most delicate viands. The vases, basins, and goblets were gold also, and of exquisite workmanship, and all the other ornaments and embellishments of the hall were answerable to this display. The princess, dazzled to see so much riches collected in one place, said to Alla ad Deen, "I thought, prince, that nothing in the world was so beautiful as the sultan my father's palace, but the sight of this hall alone is sufficient to show I was deceived." Alla ad Deen led the princess to the place appointed for her, and as soon as she and his mother were seated, a band of the most harmonious instruments, accompanied with the voices of beautiful ladies, began a concert which lasted without intermission to the end of the repast. The princess was so charmed that she declared she had never heard anything like it in the sultan her father's court, but she knew not that these musicians were fairies chosen by the genie, the slave of the lamp. When the supper was ended, there entered a company of female dancers, who performed, according to the custom of the country, several figure dances, singing at the same time verses in praise of the bride and bridegroom. About midnight, Alla ad Deen's mother conducted the bride to the nuptial apartment, and he soon after retired. The next morning, when Alla ad Deen left the bridal chamber, his attendants presented themselves to dress him, and brought him another habit as rich and magnificent as that worn the day before. He then ordered one of the horses appointed for his use to be got ready, mounted him, and went in the midst of a large troop of slaves to the sultan's palace. The sultan received him with the same honours as before, embraced him, placed him on the throne near him, and ordered a collation. Alla ad Deen said, "I beg your majesty will dispense with my eating with you today. I came to entreat you to take a repast in the princess's palace, attended by your grand vizier and all the lords of your court." The sultan consented with pleasure, rose up immediately, and, preceded by the principal officers of his palace, and followed by all the great lords of his court, accompanied Alla ad Deen. The nearer the sultan approached Alla ad Deen's palace, the more he was struck with its beauty, but was much more amazed when he entered it, and could not forbear breaking out in exclamations of approbation. But when he came into the hall, and cast his eyes on the windows enriched with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, all large perfect stones, he was so much surprised that he remained some time motionless. After he recovered himself, he said to his vizier, "Is it possible that there should be such a stately palace so near my own, and I be an utter stranger to it till now?" "Sir," replied the grand vizier, "your majesty may remember that the day before yesterday you gave Alla ad Deen, whom you accepted for your son-in-law, leave to build a palace opposite your own, and that very day at sunset there was no palace on this spot, but yesterday I had the honour first to tell you that the palace was built and finished." "I remember," replied the sultan, "but never imagined that the palace was one of the wonders of the world. For where in all the world besides shall we find walls built of massive gold and silver instead of brick, stone, or marble, and diamonds, rubies, and emeralds composing the windows?" The sultan would examine and admire the beauty of all the windows, and counting them, found that there were but 23, so richly adorned, and he was greatly astonished that the 24th was left imperfect. "Vizier," said he, for that minister made a point of never leaving him, "I am surprised that a hall of this magnificence should be left thus imperfect." "Sir," replied the grand vizier, "without doubt Alla ad Deen only wanted time to finish this window like the rest, for it is not to be supposed but that he has sufficient jewels for the purpose, or that he will not complete it the first opportunity." Alla ad Deen, who had left the sultan to go and give some orders, returned just as the vizier had finished this remark. "Son," said the sultan to him, "this hall is the most worthy of admiration of any in the world. There is only one thing that surprises me, which is to find one of the windows unfinished. Is it from the forgetfulness or negligence of the workmen, or want of time, that they have not put the finishing stroke to so beautiful a piece of architecture?" "Sir," answered Alla ad Deen, "it was for none of these reasons that your majesty sees it in this state. The omission was by design. It was by my orders that the workmen left it thus, since I wished that your majesty should have the glory of finishing this hall, and of course the palace." "If you did it with this intention," replied the sultan, "I take it kindly, and will give orders about it immediately." He accordingly sent for the most considerable jewellers and goldsmiths in his capital. Alla ad Deen then conducted the sultan into the saloon, where he had regaled his bride the preceding night. The princess entered immediately afterwards, and received the sultan her father with an air that showed how happy she was with her marriage. 2 tables were immediately spread with the most delicious meats, all served up in gold dishes. The sultan, princess, Alla ad Deen, his mother, and the grand vizier sat down at the first, and all the lords of the court at the second, which was very long. The sultan was much pleased with the cookery, and owned he had never eaten anything more excellent. He said the same of the wines, which were delicious, but what he most of all admired were 4 large sideboards, profusely furnished with large flagons, basins, and cups, all of massive gold, set with jewels. He was besides charmed with several bands of music, which were ranged along the hall, and formed most agreeable concerts. When the sultan rose from the table, he was informed that the jewellers and goldsmiths attended, upon which he returned to the hall, and showed them the window which was unfinished. "I sent for you," said he, "to fit up this window in as great perfection as the rest. Examine them well, and make all the dispatch you can." The jewellers and goldsmiths examined the 23 windows with great attention, and after they had consulted together to know what each could furnish, they returned and presented themselves before the sultan, whose principal jeweller, undertaking to speak for the rest, said, "Sir, we are all willing to exert our utmost care and industry to obey your majesty, but among us all we cannot furnish jewels enough for so great a work." "I have more than are necessary," said the sultan. "Come to my palace, and you shall choose what may answer your purpose." When the sultan returned to his palace, he ordered his jewels to be brought out, and the jewellers took a great quantity, particularly those Alla ad Deen had made him a present of, which they soon used, without making any great advance in their work. They came again several times for more, and in a month's time had not finished half their work. In short, they used all the jewels the sultan had, and borrowed of the vizier, but yet the work was not half done. Alla ad Deen, who knew that all the sultan's endeavours to make this window like the rest were in vain, sent for the jewellers and goldsmiths, and not only commanded them to desist from their work, but ordered them to undo what they had begun, and to carry all their jewels back to the sultan and to the vizier. They undid in a few hours what they had been 6 weeks about, and retired, leaving Alla ad Deen alone in the hall. He took the lamp which he carried about him, rubbed it, and presently the genie appeared. "Genie," said Alla ad Deen, "I ordered thee to leave one of the 24 windows of this hall imperfect, and thou hast executed my commands punctually. Now I would have thee make it like the rest." The genie immediately disappeared. Alla ad Deen went out of the hall, and returning soon after, found the window as he wished it to be, like the others. In the meantime, the jewellers and goldsmiths repaired to the palace, and were introduced into the sultan's presence, where the chief jeweller, presenting the precious stones which he had brought back, said in the name of all the rest, "Your Majesty knows how long we have been upon the work you were pleased to set us about, in which we used all imaginable industry. It was far advanced when Prince Alla ad Deen commanded us not only to leave off, but to undo what we had already begun, and bring your Majesty your jewels back." The sultan asked them if Alla ad Deen had given them any reason for so doing, and they answering that he had given them none, he ordered a horse to be brought, which he mounted, and rode to his son-in-law's palace, with some few attendants on foot. End of Section 20. Section 21 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 21. The Story of Alla ad Deen, or the Wonderful Lamp. Part 6. When he came there, he alighted at the staircase which led up to the hall with the 24 windows, and went directly up to it, without giving previous notice to Alla ad Deen. But it happened that at that very juncture Alla ad Deen was opportunely there, and had just time to receive him at the door. The sultan, without giving Alla ad Deen time to complain obligingly of his not having given notice, that he might have acquitted himself with the more becoming respect, said to him, "Son, I come myself to know the reason why you commanded the jewellers to desist from work, and take to pieces what they had done." Alla ad Deen disguised the true reason, which was that the sultan was not rich enough in jewels to be at so great an expense, but said, "I beg of you now to see." The sultan went directly to the window which was left imperfect, and when he found it like the rest, fancied that he was mistaken, examined the 2 windows on each side, and afterwards all the 24. But when he was convinced that the window which several workmen had been so long about was finished in so short a time, he embraced Alla ad Deen and kissed him between his eyes. "My son," said he, "what a man you are to do such surprising things always in the twinkling of an eye. There is not your fellow in the world. The more I know, the more I admire you." Alla ad Deen received these praises from the sultan with modesty, and replied in these words, "Sir, it is a great honour to me to deserve your Majesty's goodwill and approbation, and I assure you I shall study to deserve them more." The sultan returned to his palace, but would not let Alla ad Deen attend him. When he came there, he found his grand vizier waiting, to whom he related the wonder he had witnessed with the utmost admiration, and in such terms as left the minister no room to doubt but that the facet was as the sultan related it, though he was the more confirmed in his belief that Alla ad Deen's palace was the effect of enchantment, as he had told the sultan the first moment he saw it. He was going to repeat the observation, but the sultan interrupted him and said, "You told me so once before. I see, vizier, you have not forgotten your son's espousals to my daughter." The frank vizier plainly saw how much the sultan was prepossessed, therefore avoided disputes, and let him remain in his own opinion, The Sultan, as soon as he rose every morning, went into the closet to look at Alla ad Deen's palace, and would go many times in a day to contemplate and admire it. Alla ad Deen did not confine himself in his palace, but took care to show himself once or twice a week in the town, by going sometimes to one mosque and sometimes to another to prayers, or to visit the Grand Vizier, who affected to pay his court to him on certain days, or to do the principal lords of the court the honour to return their visits after he had regaled them at his palace. Every time he went out, he caused 2 slaves who walked by the side of his horse to throw handfuls of money among the people as he passed through the streets and squares, which were generally on those occasions crowded. Besides, no one came to his palace gates to ask alms, but returned satisfied with his liberality. In short, he so divided his time that not a week passed but he went either once or twice a hunting, sometimes in the environs of the city, sometimes farther off, at which time the villages through which he passed felt the effects of his generosity, which gained him the love and blessings of the people, and it was common for them to swear by his head. Thus, without giving the least umbrage to the Sultan, to whom he paid all imaginable respect, Alla ad Deen, by his affable behaviour and liberality, had won the affections of the people, and was more beloved than the Sultan himself. With all these good qualities, he showed a courage and a zeal for the public good which could not be sufficiently applauded. He gave sufficient proofs of both in a revolt on the borders of the kingdom, for he no sooner understood that the Sultan was levying an army to disperse the rebels than he begged the command of it, which he found not difficult to obtain. As soon as he was empowered, he marched with so much expedition that the Sultan heard of the defeat of the rebels before he had received an account of his arrival in the army. And though this action rendered his name famous throughout the kingdom, it made no alteration in his disposition, but he was as affable after his victory as before. Alla ad Deen had conducted himself in this manner several years, when the African magician, who undesignedly had been the instrument of raising him to so high a pitch of prosperity, recalled him to his recollection in Africa, whither after his expedition he had returned, and though he was almost persuaded that Alla ad Deen must have died miserably in the subterraneous abode where he had left him, yet he had the curiosity to inform himself about his end with certainty, and as he was a great geomancer, he took out of a cupboard a square covered box, which he used in his geomantic observations, then sat himself down on the sofa, set it before him, and uncovered it. After he had prepared and levelled the sand which was in it, with an intention to discover whether or no Alla ad Deen had died in the subterraneous abode, he cast the points, drew the figures, and formed a horoscope, by which, when he came to examine it, he found that Alla ad Deen, instead of dying in the cave, had made his escape, lived splendidly, was in possession of the wonderful lamp, had married a princess, and was much honoured and respected. The magician no sooner understood, by the rules of his diabolical art, that Alla ad Deen had arrived to this height of good fortune, than his face became inflamed with anger, and he cried out in a rage, "This sorry tailor's son has discovered the secret and virtue of the lamp. I believed his death to be certain, but find that he enjoys the fruit of my labour and study. I will, however, prevent his enjoying it long, or perish in the attempt." He was not a great while deliberating on what he should do, but the next morning mounted a barb, set forwards, and never stopped but to refresh himself and horse till he arrived at the capital of China. He alighted, took up his lodging in a khan, and stayed there the remainder of the day and the night, to refresh himself after so long a journey. The next day his first object was to inquire what people said of Alla ad Deen, and taking a walk through the town, he went to the most public and frequented places, where persons of the best distinction met to drink a certain warm liquor, which he had drunk often during his former visit. As soon as he had seated himself, he was presented with a cup of it, which he took, but listening at the same time to the discourse of the company on each side of him, he heard them talking of Alla ad Deen's palace. When he had drunk off his liquor, he joined them, and taking this opportunity, inquired particularly of what palace they spoke with so much commendation. "From whence come you?" said the person to whom he addressed himself. "You must certainly be a stranger not to have seen or heard talk of Prince Alla ad Deen's palace," for he was called so after his marriage with the princess. "I do not say," continued the man, "that it is one of the wonders of the world, but that it is the only wonder of the world, since nothing so grand, rich, and magnificent was ever beheld. Certainly you must have come from a great distance, or some obscure corner, not to have heard of it, for it must have been talked of all over the world. Go and see it, and then judge whether I have told you more than the truth." "Forgive my ignorance," replied the African magician. "I arrived here but yesterday, and came from the farthest part of Africa, where the fame of this palace had not reached when I came away. The business which brought me hither was so urgent, that my sole object was to arrive as soon as I could, without stopping anywhere, or making any acquaintance. But I will not fail to go and see it. My impatience is so great, I will go immediately and satisfy my curiosity, if you will do me the favour to show me the way thither." The person to whom the African magician addressed himself took a great pleasure in showing him the way to Alla ad Deen's palace, and he got up and went thither instantly. When he came to the palace and had examined it on all sides, he doubted not but that Alla ad Deen had made use of the lamp to build it. Without attending to the inability of a poor tailor's son, he knew that none but the genie, the slaves of the lamp, the attaining of which he had missed, could have performed such wonders; and piqued to the quick at Alla ad Deen's happiness and splendour, he returned to the khan where he lodged. The next point was to ascertain where the lamp was, whether Alla ad Deen carried it about with him, or where he kept it, and this he was to discover by an operation of geomancy. As soon as he entered his lodging, he took his square box of sand, which he always carried with him when he travelled, and after he had performed some operations, he found that the lamp was in Alla ad Deen's palace, and so great was his joy at the discovery that he could hardly contain himself. "Well," said he, "I shall have the lamp, and defy Alla ad Deen's preventing my carrying it off, and making him sink to his original meanness, from which he has taken so high a flight." It was Alla ad Deen's misfortune at that time to be absent in the chase for 8 days, and only 3 were expired, which the magician came to know by this means. After he had performed the magical operation, which gave him so much joy, he went to the superintendent of the khan, entered into conversation with him on indifferent subjects, and among the rest told him he had been to see Alla ad Deen's palace, and after exaggerating on all that he had seen most worthy of observation, added, "But my curiosity leads me farther, and I shall not be satisfied till I have seen the person to whom this wonderful edifice belongs." "That will be no difficult matter," replied the master of the khan. "There is not a day passes but he gives an opportunity when he is in town, but at present he is not at the palace, and has been gone these 3 days on a hunting match, which will last 8. The magician wanted to know no more. He took his leave of the superintendent of the khan, and returning to his own chamber, said to himself, "This is an opportunity I ought by no means to neglect, but must make the best use of it." To that end he went to a coppersmith and asked for 12 copper lamps. The master of the shop told him he had not so many by him, but if he would have patience till the next day, he would have them ready. The magician appointed his time, and desired him to take care that they should be handsome and well polished. After promising to pay him well, he returned to his inn. The next day the magician called for the 12 lamps, paid the man his full price, put them into a basket which he bought on purpose, and, with the basket hanging on his arm, went directly to Alla ad Deen's palace. As he approached, he began crying, "Who will change old lamps for new ones?" As he went along, a crowd of children collected, who hooted, and thought him, as did all who chanced to be passing by, a madman or a fool, to offer to change new lamps for old ones. The African magician regarded not their scoffs, hootings, or all they could say to him, but still continued crying, "Who will change old lamps for new?" He repeated this so often, walking backwards and forwards in front of the palace, that the princess, who was then in the hall with the 24 windows, hearing a man cry something, and not being able to distinguish his words, owing to the hooting of the children and increasing mob about him, sent one of her women slaves to know what he cried. The slave was not long before she returned, and ran into the hall, laughing so heartily that the princess could not forbear herself. "Well, giggler," said the princess, "will you tell me what you laugh at?" "Madam," answered the slave, laughing still, "who can forbear laughing to see a fool with a basket on his arm full of fine new lamps ask to change them for old ones, the children and mob crowding about him so that he can hardly stir, make all the noise they can in derision of him?" Another female slave, hearing this, said, "Now you speak of lamps, I know not whether the princess may have observed it, but there is an old one upon a shelf of the prince's robing room, and whoever owns it will not be sorry to find a new one in its stead. If the princess chooses, she may have the pleasure of trying if this fool is so silly as to give a new lamp for an old one, without taking anything for the exchange." The lamp this slave spoke of was the wonderful lamp which Alla ad Deen had laid upon the shelf before he departed for the chase. This he had done several times before, but neither the princess, the slaves, nor the eunuchs had ever taken notice of it. At all other times, except when hunting, he carried it about his person. The princess, who knew not the value of this lamp, and the interest that Alla ad Deen, not to mention herself, had to keep it safe, entered into the pleasantry, and commanded a eunuch to take it and make the exchange. The eunuch obeyed, went out of the hall, and no sooner got to the palace gates than he saw the African magician, called to him, and showing him the old lamp, said, "Give me a new lamp for this." The magician never doubted but that this was the lamp he wanted. There could be no other such in this palace, where every utensil was gold or silver. He snatched it eagerly out of the eunuch's hand, and thrusting it as far as he could into his breast, offered him his basket, and bade him choose which he liked best. The eunuch picked out one, and carried it to the princess, but the exchange was no sooner made than the place rung with the shouts of the children, deriding the magician's folly. The African magician gave everybody leave to laugh as much as they pleased. He stayed not long near the palace, but made the best of his way, without crying any longer, "New lamps for old ones." His end was answered, and by his silence he got rid of the children and the mob. As soon as he was out of the square between the two palaces, he hastened down the streets which were the least frequented, and having no more occasion for his lamps or basket, set all down in an alley, where nobody saw him. Then going down another street or two, he walked till he came to one of the city gates, and pursuing his way through the suburbs, which were very extensive, at length reached a lonely spot, where he stopped for a time to execute the design he had in contemplation, never caring for his horse, which he had left at the khan, but thinking himself perfectly compensated by the treasure he had acquired. Section 21.